Before we start, I want to thank our sponsor, Kyndryl, who runs and reimagines the technology systems that drive advantage for the world's leading businesses. With a unique blend of AI-powered consulting built on unmatched managed service capability, Kyndryl helps leaders harness the power of technology for smarter decisions, faster innovation, and a lasting competitive edge. You can find out more about Kyndryl at kyndryl.com. I thought I'd introduce today's episode with a beautiful quote from Norwegian scholar Evelyn Linder and Auschwitz survivor Joe Linzer from 2004. Pessimism is a luxury affordable only in good times. In difficult times, optimism is a duty, because pessimism easily turns into a self-inflicted, self-fulfilling death sentence. Absolutely beautiful. A way to introduce our guests for part 2 of Navigating the Age of Chaos. Bob Johansen and Jamais Cascio, welcome back to the show.
Thank you.
Great to have you back, gents. I thought we'd start, Bob, with you because I wanted to share something that you had introduced that a lot of people didn't know, which was VUCA Plus, which was going back a while, but I thought we'd start there because you've worked a lot with the American War College. You were there around the time they introduced VUCA, and you gave an antidote to VUCA, which was VUCA Plus, and that will actually set us up nice for BANI Plus. But let's start with this VUCA Plus.
So VUCA was a term, it was actually coined in the late 1980s. It was post-Cold War, so it was Cold War framing. I learned about it the week before 9/11, when I just happened to be there at the Army War College in Carlisle, Pennsylvania, with a group of senior executives, and I learned about VUCA. And I got intrigued by it. I brought senior business executives to the War College a number of times, and I then began working with the War College, and I've been promoted over the years. So I work with the new generals now, the new 3-star generals on their first week in Washington. And as a futurist, I felt like I needed to start from that frame, but flip it positive and bring it into the future. And what we realized, if you think future back, the idea of volatility yields to vision. So in a volatile period, vision gets disproportionately rewarded. Uncertainty yields to understanding. So in a VUCA period, you want to be listening to people, not shouting at them. And that was a really important lesson, that when you don't know what's going on, you should be asking questions. And then complexity yields to clarity. And they have a whole language around this. They call it commander's intent and mission command, and my favorite, Flexive Command. And we talk about this in our book because it's still relevant. And the message is command and control doesn't really work in the VUCA world or in the BANI world. Command and control just doesn't work in the same way. You can't just tell people what to do. But what you can do is be very clear about direction, but very flexible about execution. So we call that clarity. We call that clarity in our book. And then finally, ambiguity yields to agility. So essentially, we all have to be corporate athletes. We have to be very flexible in how we respond to these situations and not be stuck in this kind of assumption of certainty or the quest for certainty. Certainty gets dangerous in the VUCA world, and it gets increasingly dangerous in the BANI future.
I love the flexive control. I sent it to so many leaders that I know as well today. Maybe we'll expand on that because we've already piqued people's interest.
Yeah, that's an interesting one. It hasn't spread as much yet, but Flexive Command means continuously reevaluating who's in the best position to make which decision at what time based on continuous after-action reviews and continuous situation analysis, where you're constantly assessing what's going around you in terms of danger, but also in terms of opportunity. But after-action reviews are a big piece of that too, where another big lesson for me is the military is much better at that than business. In my experience, they're very good at assessing situations and figure out what went well and what could be improved.
Fantastic. So let's get stuck into BANI Plus, and the B of BANI Plus is bendable. But I thought what we'd do was, Jamais, come to you to tell us about the B of BANI, and then come to Bob to tell us about the B Plus. And you get an A plus if you nail the B plus.
So the B in BANI refers to brittle. That is, systems that appear strong, that may function well until they don't. And they break in a shattering way, catastrophically. And there are a number of reasons for that, but it all boils down to demands being made that are greater than what those systems can support. Bob?
In a brittle future, you want to be bendable, but not in the wishy-washy sense. You want to be bendable within a kind of envelope of clarity, or a envelope really of resilient clarity. It's very important. So you can't be certain in this kind of world. Brittle systems look strong. That's the really deceptive thing about them, but they don't fail gracefully. So you have to be prepared. So you go in with a strategy, first of all, that assesses the situation. So your expectations are accurate. And you're better off if you're not sure, is this a resilient or a brittle system? You're better off assuming it's brittle, because if it's resilient, you're going to be fine. But your strategy is to be bendable as you're going in, not rigid, and then keep reminding yourself of your clarity, because the clarity provides direction for you, and you don't expect certainty.
I love that, Bob. And, it reminded me of your book, Full Spectrum Thinking. And I think it was chapter 8 of that book. And I share this with so many leaders. I've used it so many times. Leaders will need to be very clear about where they want to go, but very flexible about how they get there. And
exactly.
Absolutely love that. But one of the things, and I'm probably dragging in here some of the future of this book, your final chapter, you talk about some of the skills that leaders will need. And one of those skills that you've been a huge advocate for a very long time is future back thinking. So maybe I'll connect that here at this stage for people.
Sure.
Because it works well here.
It sure does. And, most of us think from the present forward. It's just kind of built in. And, it's not surprising. That's the way we live, from the present forward. So it's kind of the way that feels the most natural. But in an increasingly chaotic world, and what Jamais first called the BANI future, you're going to see things that are very mixed up, very scattered, very jittery, very ragged in their orientation. And in the present, in that kind of world, gets so noisy, just so noisy, it's really hard to understand what's going on. But if you think future back, you get a fresh take on where things are. And one of the big surprises of the futures work we've been doing for so long, one of the big surprises is it's actually easier to go 10 years out and think future back than it is to look from the present, the noisy present, out 10 years. People are often saying to me in Silicon Valley, well, how can you do 10-year forecasting? I can't even do 1 or 2. Well, the reason is because it's easier. Once you get a sense of directionality, you're not predicting outcomes. That's not predictable. And as Jamais said the first episode, we don't even use the word prediction. But you can get that sense of direction. And that's where the clarity comes from. So you think future back for clarity. We also look to history. So in our framework, we look at least 50 years back when we're doing a 10-year forecast. And we look 10 years ahead. So it's like a 60-year swath of time. And we think back for patterns. We're always looking for patterns. We often see echoes of the past. It doesn't literally repeat itself, but certainly it echoes. So you want to look back because almost nothing happens that's truly new. And almost everything that happens was tried and failed years before. So we really want to look at history. And yet that future back view is necessary to get the clarity of direction.
And Bob, I just want to throw in big shout out to your mom, the beautiful motto that you shared in the book, that I'll bloom where I'm planted. Love that. Yes. Love that. That's another one I took away as well. Jamais, Bob made the comment in part 1 about how you were one of the best scenario writers he's ever met, or the best, perhaps.
He's the
best. This idea of future back is core to what you do as a scenario writer as well. I can't remember the term, but you talked about some type of predictive history. I think that was the term. Anticipatory history. Let's share that. It's a beautiful term, anticipatory history, and how future back works for that.
Well, one of my undergraduate degrees is actually in history. And I have found over the years that the kinds of dynamics that we studied when we look back at history as historians, as historiographers, are precisely the kinds of dynamics that are in play when we look ahead. And so rather than taking, just as if we would take the present and look back from that to understand how we got where we are today, if we imagine ourselves 10 years out and then look back from that imagined point and think about how those dynamics will play out over that 10-year period. It's future back thinking. It's also historian thinking. It's really trying to understand how dynamics play together. Seemingly disparate dynamics can intertwine to lead us to the world that we have or the world that we might have.
So let's share a couple of examples, because in each chapter, the book covers how organizations lean into these different elements and then how an individual can as well. You give the example of Blue Sky. It's actually something I never really got into. I started when it first came out and then I kind of forgot about it, but you reminded me of it in this book, and the AT protocol. I'd love you to share that.
So the AT protocol is something that was actually developed at Twitter when they were looking for a way to essentially become more open source. But then even though leadership changed and they decided to dump the project, the people who were working on this project decided to stick with it, including the person who's now the CEO of Blue Sky, Jay Grigg. And they spun off into this system that essentially allows for social networking without top-down control. It still allows for server-based network, so it's not entirely distributed, but it makes it so that all of the protocols are shared, such that someone could start up an alternative to Blue Sky or come up with a photography version of Blue Sky. And as a member of the original Blue Sky, I could just start connecting to that other site and have all of my friend networks, have all of my material, have all of my data. I could move entirely. I could do both. Basically, I control my data. And from the bendable and resilience point of view, what it means is that no one is dependent upon the survival or the sanity of the leadership of Blue Sky. If somebody comes in who starts to try to turn it into something crazy, starts to impose their AI into everything or whatever, I'm just imagining that's a possibility. You don't have to stick with it. You're not stuck with it. You can actually move to someplace else and still retain your network, still retain your social network.
How does that work from a bendable perspective? What are the core messages an organization can take from that?
Well, this is actually, it is resilience and bendability for the user as much as for the organization. It means the organization does not have to remain in the exact same format or the exact same structure the entire time. It gives it room to expand and to experiment, knowing that even with the experimentation, the people can, its membership can remain or can move as needed. For the members, it means that they are not subject to the top-down control of the owners of that network. They are allowed to try something new without losing their social footprint. And that's the really critical part. And where the resilience comes from, especially for the users, it's a way to maintain your connections. And we all know how important connections are. From an organizational perspective, you do that because it's attractive to users. You may not have an immediate short-term return for you, but it will be something that your members will remember and will be attracted to.
And Bob, this reminds me of your shape-shifting organization. I remember that from last time we spoke. And I constantly think of the idea of a murmuration, an organization as a murmuration, companies like Hire, for example, who flock around opportunities or threats. And it links nicely to your Flexive Command.
Yeah, no, it really does. And that's the organizational model that I think you'll see emerging now. And, we've been anticipating this for a long time, but it's actually taken longer to start to play out than we thought. And it's had different wrinkles than we thought. I first used the term fishnet organization, years and years ago. And the model was a fishnet on the dock, and you pick up any node in a hierarchy phones, and you put that down, pick up another node. That kind of increasingly distributed. We did call it shape-shifting organizations. I like that, with all due cultural respect to the term. I also like the slightly spiritual element of shape-shifting. In a recent issue of Harvard Business Review, some authors use a new term, the octopus organization, which is, I don't know. It's okay. It's the same concept. I don't particularly like it, but it's the same concept. And here's where I think, as a humble futurist, I have to say that I kind of got this wrong, but maybe in the long run it will play out. But I thought, I grew up with social media, so my first professional paper was in 1972 when the ARPANET was publicly announced. And when I was a PhD student at Northwestern, I had my first identity as an ARPANET participant. And I thought that these networks would become increasingly distributed, that essentially anything that can be distributed will be distributed, and that these networks would accelerate that, and that they'd be democratically organized. And even if they couldn't be forced into being hierarchical because it's so distributed, there still is an element of that. But I didn't anticipate how social media would become so angry and so now more centralized. I just didn't anticipate that. And I hope that in the long run, maybe the core forecast will hold, but it's really been more complicated than we thought.
It's sometimes difficult to be a futurist when you are optimistic about people.
Yeah, there you go. There's the fishnet. Okay, good. Thank you.
Yeah, I was like, I have that somewhere, and I just looked at my notes, and there it is. For people who are watching us on YouTube, you'll see the fishnet organization. 2020, Bob, that's when we spoke. It was in the middle of the pandemic as well, so perfect time for talking about fishnet organizations. Maybe not fishnet tights, but fishnet organizations, yes.
Yeah.
So
polymorphic.
Yeah. Polymorphic. There you go.
Beautiful, beautiful. One last thing on this was how individuals can bend brittle. So you talked about flexibility there, and actually in a corporate athlete sense. And you talk about this a lot in the book, which may surprise people, that actually looking after your health, looking after mindfulness, looking after those elements creates a resilience in you as an individual as well. It would be remiss of us not to cover that.
Yeah, I'm glad you introduced that. We were very lucky as we were writing. There was a social psychologist at Northwestern, Judith Moskowitz, right at the time we were writing. She developed a series of methodologies for coping with very stressful medical situations. And she published those. And actually, this was in a very kind of beginning crazy period, as it seems like we've had so often lately. But she actually produced those on public radio in the U.S. to share methods of coping with extreme stress. And she learned those in the medical world. So it was things like having a partner with dementia or a terminal cancer diagnosis. So there were things that weren't going to get better, but you could make a choice either to find what little joy there was in those situations or to be just pulled into depression and despair. And it was very interesting. So in the book, we have those methods, and then Jamais and I and Angela added to them and stretched them and made them more future back. But a lot of them are not new, like mindfulness you mentioned, or gratitude journals, things like that. But the important thing at the brittle level, life can be brittle. And if we can begin with an expectation that we need to be appreciative of the positive things, even in the midst of all the negativity, and if we can be disciplined in our approach, a phrase that's used sometimes is persistent prayer. So it isn't just prayer, kind of asking God for stuff. It's the discipline, however you practice it, and whether God is involved or not, the persistent practices of positivity, of faith in something better. Those things have a real benefit. And even though it can be hard to measure, but it really is important. So in chapters 6 through 9, the positive BANI chapters, we have examples of organizations that have flipped it positive, of individuals who have flipped it positive. And then at the back, we've got personal suggestions. A lot of them come from cognitive behavioral therapy, basically the principles of pulling out positive emotions and exercising those and trying to get past and not to ignore, but to play through negative emotions.
Yeah, and you talk about some of the guests we've had on the show. We've had Dan Siegel on the show before.
Yeah.
You have David Rock there as well.
Yeah, of course.
And the reason I share that is this is such an important aspect. And one of the things that came to mind, Joe Dispenza, if you ever read Joe Dispenza's work, he talks about how when you do future back thinking as an individual, you actually rehearse those neuronal connections
Yes.
backwards. So I often think about it like the idea of firing an arrow into the future, but this is more like firing a harpoon into the future, that you can actually bring that future back.
Pull it back. Yeah.
And not always what Jamais' futures are. Not all parts of those futures, the BANI futures. But I just found it's such an important part of the picture that's rarely spoken about in the work of futurism, because it's usually a different field. It's in neuropsychology or neuroscience, but it's such an integral part of being able to manage yourself in a BANI world.
Yeah, that's right. And, David and Dan developed this healthy mind platter, too, that they probably talked about in your show, but it's basically the elements of brain health, of mind health that we all need to cope. And I've done talks for David, too, and his audiences to try to bring more of a foresight or future back perspective to that neuroscience work, because a lot of that is very focused on the moment and the kind of present conditions, and clinical neuroscience is, of course, treating them. What we're trying to bring is a future back perspective, but that stuff's very relevant to what we're talking about.
Jeremy, I'm going to bring you in here because I love this piece that you talked about. My background's in sports, so my understanding of, in order to build the muscle, you first need to break it down. So every time you do weights, what you're essentially doing is breaking the muscle down, but also that scar tissue is stronger than normal tissue. And you talk about how in a BANI world, in a BANI future, in a BANI present, that a leader that's had some type of crisis personally, an anxious crisis, for example, or maybe they've had some type of breakdown, or they suffer from bipolar disorder or something like that. And you mentioned a book that I bought straight away, A First Rate Madness, that book. But you also talk about, I thought about this, that having survived some type of struggle like that mentally is exactly the same as having gone through a lot of weight training to build a muscle. Right. It builds the mental muscle. So I'd love you to share this before we move on to the next of the BANI Plus.
Well, just the idea here is that when you, as a leader, when you have grappled with issues like depression, which is what I have personal familiarity with, what you are doing is you are building up the capacity not just to see all the misery around you, but also to see through it. Understand where it's limited, to understand how you can make use of it, and what you can do to adapt it to part of your reality, and not let it be something that simply smothers you. It is, in a way, having a depressive disorder can make someone be more of an optimist. Because what you can do, that when you have a depressive disorder that you are able to grapple with, that you can deal with, that success is possible. And as cliche as it is, it gets better. And even if it's something that you return to on a regular basis, that's one of the things about depression, a number of other disorders, other mental conditions, they don't ever really go away. But you develop the skills around grappling with chaos, really, whether it's mental chaos or environmental chaos.
I do think that all challenges pay off in some way, and sometimes not immediately either. I was telling my kids one day, I was bathing my son when he was a baby, and he used to love, you know when you're in the bath as a kid and your parent might swoosh the water and you start to move forward and back. So I was teaching him one of these lessons that at the time I thought was totally missed, which was when you have a body of water like that, it's the same body of the water in the bath. There's a high and a low at the same time. And that when you're in the low, there's a high coming, and when you're on a high, there's a low coming. So prepare for both, because that's actually what life is. And a few days later, my son had broken his arm and he couldn't go to a party that he wanted to go to. And he said it to me. He said, I was just in the low of the wave. And I was like,
oh, nice.
He listened. This is probably the first time and only time he listened to me. But anyway, I think this one was such an important one to call out. But let's move on to A in BANI Plus, which is attentive. But I thought, Jamais, I'd love you again to give us a one-liner on what the A of BANI is. And then, Bob, if you take us away on what BANI Plus A is.
The A in BANI refers to anxious or anxiety-inducing. And what we see around us in a BANI world is a constant sense of dread. This feeling that there are no good options remaining, that we have nowhere to go that will make things better. And it's very easy to see that, especially when we have systems, whether they're social media or political systems, that continuously push us to feel angry and upset. And it's really hard to escape that sense of anxiety. Bob?
The beginning is to be recognizing of what's going on, to be attentive. And so oftentimes with people who are anxious, they're ignored. And to be anxious and ignored is to amplify the anxiousness. So the beginning, I think, is to pay attention. But we also talk about active empathy. So you want to not only pay attention and acknowledge, but have a kind of empathy of what's going on. And asking questions can really help. Trying to understand can really help. To put yourself in that position to the extent you can really help. And as Jamais said in the first episode, the A in BANI, the anxious, is what we hear the most about when we give talks, because there's so much of it around. Everybody gets this one. The function that feels most responsibility right now is the human resource function, or the people function, as it's often called in American companies now. But in fact, it's not just the specialists in human resources or the people function. It's really everybody. So we all have a responsibility. And in these kind of weird times, even the word empathy is actually controversial in Silicon Valley. You know, does empathy make it look like you're feeling soft or you're not at your competitive best or whatever? So it really is an interesting and somewhat troubling conversation about what is the role of active empathy and how does that play out. But, you know, our forecast is that empathy will come back into fashion because it's so important to make sense out of what's going on. And it really is the motivation for making things better.
Empathy is forward-looking.
Yeah.
That's one of the things that has always struck me about the people who are anti-empathy. You know, the folks out there who are even saying in the last year, empathy is evil. For the listeners, I have a baffled look on my face. It is, the thing about empathy is it's reciprocal. And it may not be reciprocal in every single episode, but you are building out a network of people who have empathy for you as well. And so when I say it's forward-looking, what I mean is that it's building out as you move forward, as you continue to be empathetic, as you continue to have people who have empathy for you, you're building out this set of connections. You are looking ahead to a persistent connection,
Yes,
as opposed to just a one-off interaction.
yes. That's so interesting, Jamais. And you're right. I think empathy is forward-looking, but so is anxiety. You know, anxiety is forward-looking. Depression is past-oriented. You know, depression is looking back, in effect. but anxiety is really inherently future-oriented.
Well, it's future-oriented, but it's only able to see one future often.
Or no future.
Well, no future, what I'm thinking, or just a bunch of illustrations, a bunch of images, all a collage of bad futures that's what anxiety feels like to me, at least.
Yeah, and I think you're right, and it's kind of what could go wrong, but that is future oriented.
I share this openly, a major lesson in empathy on a show with a lady called Terry Givens on her book called Radical Empathy. And in the middle of the show, not rehearsed in any way, because I would never do that. You know me, I don't do that. I prepare by reading the book and maybe watching some videos, etc. But I'd read her book, Radical Empathy, and she's a black lady living in America. And she talked about she's married to a white man and how so much difference shows up for her. And she said this in passing to me. She goes, you know, my kids were playing, I have two boys playing out the front garden, playing cops and robbers, and you know what that's like. And I was like, in my head, I was like, yeah, they must have hurt each other fighting. And she's like going, no. She's like, you have to be careful that they don't actually get shot for having toy guns in America because they're black children. And I was gobsmacked.
Wow.
And that was like, even if you're trying to be empathetic, it's still so difficult to get inside someone else's head. Jamais, you've struggled with depression, so you know what that is versus what we might project that it's like. And it's a totally different thing.
Right. And I think it's incumbent upon people who have a higher position in society, deserved or otherwise, to have the greatest empathy for others, to recognize that you may be playing the world on easy mode. Not everybody is. You need to be aware of that.
Yeah, absolutely.
That's actually what there is a self-help game. And the way you just decide the difficulty level of the game is by how dark your skin is. So if you're playing as a white kid, you're playing on easy mode. If you're playing as a black kid, you're not.
Wow. I mean, anyway, it was a lesson that you may think you're being empathetic, but you can do your best. But at least you're trying, which is a big thing.
Yeah.
There was a couple of lines I absolutely loved from this chapter, and I maybe it fits more into your bucket here, Bob. You said the best solutions are likely to emerge from those closest to the crisis. Trust is seeded before a crisis, but blossoms during a crisis. Perfect for what happened in the pandemic. And then this one was even more perfect for what happened in the pandemic, especially when it broke out and people didn't know what the heck was going on. You said, anxiety spreads fastest when leaders go silent, when nobody steps up to provide clarity in a world that doesn't make sense anymore. Those two together are beautiful lines to describe something that was very anxiety inducing.
Yeah, it sure was. And here we talked a lot with Angela and about United Way and how they responded. There's a number of examples in the book about how United Way was able to be there with people in a firsthand way. And United Way is very distributed. It's not a centralized organization. And Angela is the CEO of United Way worldwide, but it's a federated organization. So the local organizations have their own structure and their own fundraising and some of their own practices, but there's a orchestration that happens at the global level. But I do think that principle of learn from the field and listen to the field is so important. But that goes back to, you want to have that listening and the response be within your envelope of clarity. You know, what are your values? What's your mission? What's your vision that carries your strategy out? But you've got to have the empathy of what that's like from each of the areas you're trying to help.
One of the other examples you give that people might be more familiar with is Airbnb and how they actually enhanced communications that eased not only anxiety for guests, but also hosts and their own people as well. I'd love you to share this one.
Yeah, that was a surprise, actually, that I didn't realize that till we were doing the research. But what they did was try to figure out how to respond to the situation when suddenly people weren't traveling and there were a number of travel reservations broken because of fear of travel and the like. And what they did was try to look at it locally and figure out what was going on and try to respond to that anxiety, both for the travelers and for the hosts. And then it turned out there were these interesting situations where once it was realized that this was a long-term deal, Airbnb became a place to help people relocate to a nicer place to live during that period and view it, but it's very different than the rental model that they had before. So I think that the idea is just figuring out how to make it a better experience given what's going on. It's very interesting now in the sort of post-pandemic period that they're now offering additional experiences on top of this. So if you rent a place in the mountains for skiing, they'll help you find a ski instructor, or if you're renting a place for cooking, they'll help you find a chef, or whatever. But it's basically an experience economy play, as Joe Pine and Jim Gilmore talk about it, where you're not just selling a service, you're selling an experience. And that same logic, I think, applied in a different way when they figured out how to flip the COVID experience into something that was, if not positive, at least viable for all the parties.
The communication as a way of pushing back against anxiety. I think there is an example that nearly all of us here, certainly all of us here, probably everyone or most of the people listening, have experienced that if you are on an airplane and you're getting ready to take off and then you just sit there on the tarmac and sit there for an extended period without moving and the pilot is silent, the anxiety builds, how long is this going to take, what's going to happen, what's going on, is there an emergency? When the pilot, and I've had a few times when the pilot says, just to keep you updated, this is what's going on, I'll check back in 10 minutes, let you know what if there's any updated information. And basically that little bit of communication that where the pilot acknowledges that the people in the tube are wondering what's going on, are building anxiety, has a remarkably calming effect.
Yes.
Even if the update is, there is no update. It's an update.
Yeah.
That's it. That even if the update is there's no update, being kept in the loop matters, makes a big difference.
Yeah, I agree. That's so true. When I've traveled a lot in my career, and there was a technology, I think was in the days of the DC-10, the DC-10 aircraft, one of the first of the wide bodies. There was a camera, so you could actually look into the cockpit as you were sitting there as a passenger. I found that comforting in the same way, Jamais, just to see that they're all quiet up there and they're all kind of doing their business. They're not running around in a crazy way, So there can be ways, I think, of providing that kind of comfort that there's something going on and you kind of relieve some of the anxiety. But I agree. Just having somebody tell you what's going on makes such a big difference. Even if they don't know what's going on, at least that's reassuring you that nothing bad is going on.
I always thought about that we're meaning-making entities, humans are, and we'll look for a story, and the story is usually a negative one. So,
you can make it up if you don't hear it.
Yeah, so give them a story because they're going to make one up anyway. There's a great example. So I mentioned how you talk about organizations. You talked about Angela's organization. You also talked about Airbnb. But you also talk about how individuals can attend to anxious. And you gave a beautiful story here about Kate Darling. And actually, I have to tell you, I have a robot vacuum at home. I've treated it totally differently since I read about this. But I love this quote that stood out. Ethical bounce ropes. Love that term, bounce ropes. And we'll come back to that later on. Ethical bounce ropes could keep technology and humans in a safe and ethical space. while also flexing to allow for surprises and to make unintended negative consequences less likely. This sets us up beautifully for this story.
Mm-hmm. So that the idea is there's such a pressure now around AI, and Jamais and I talked a lot about AI, and we have somewhat differing views on it. But one of the places where I think we agree is that we don't know yet what this technology is, that we know what some of it is, but we don't know what all of it is. It's a phenomenon. So we have to figure out a way to engage with it. And I personally think it's too early for guardrails. That's the term that's being used, especially by politicians who have different motivations or maybe unintended consequences. But, most of them have very little information that they're running on, and they're obviously very polarized. So the kind of guardrails that are going to come out of it are bound to be counterintuitive and probably dysfunctional. But we do need ethical concern and ethical guidelines, if nothing else. But I think it has to be more than that. So the metaphor that I used in a separate book I did earlier this year called Leaders Make the Future, the 3rd edition, was bounce ropes. And it's like a wrestling ring or a boxing ring where you want to keep people in the ring legally and ethically and safely, but you also want flex in those boundaries that are holding it in. But the interesting thing about boxing rings and wrestling rings, they've got 4 stanchions, which are the posts, and those are rigid. So I think it's a good metaphor to say, well, if you're trying to figure out how to guide a technology so it emphasizes the good things and tries to de-emphasize the bad things, think of it as a wrestling ring. And where do you want the stanchions, the things that you don't give on? And where do you want the bounce ropes?
And let's share that lady, Kate Darling, so people know what I was talking about with my robot vacuum cleaner.
Yeah, so Kate Darling's at the Media Lab, and she's got a book called The New Breed. And she's studied the ethics of how we treat animals. And then she's also in the Media Lab. So it's really an interesting background. And what she says is we should treat these chatbots, again, the language is not very good, agents. I've nicknamed mine Stretch, because I use it only to stretch my thinking. I don't trust it, and I don't use it at the end of projects. I only use it to stretch my thinking. But what she recommends is treat it like a beloved pet as compared to like a machine. And I've tried to do that, and I'm very respectful in my interactions with Stretch. And I know it can be kind of anthropomorphizing, and it's got dangers and all those kinds of things. But at least for me as a writer, I've found it really, really useful. But again, it's really important to say I use it early in projects, and I'm in constant conversation early in projects. I don't use it late, and I don't trust it. So that's really a specific kind of application. But I do have a friendly kind of relationship, and I really do find Kate Darling's book provocative about how can we learn from how we have treated animals for good or for evil, and apply that to how we're treating this new generation of technology that we don't even have language to talk about it. And the term we have, artificial intelligence, that's the worst term to describe an emerging technology I've ever studied. So it just creates all kinds of bad stories out of it. And some of those are worth worrying about, but we just don't have good language. I think generative AI is better. We use the term augmented intelligence, where the human is in the center and it's about augmentation. But this is a topic in and of itself.
Right. Do you guys remember the Big Dog video from Boston Dynamics about 10, 15 years ago?
Oh, yeah, I do remember. Yeah.
First of all, right, one of the highlights of the video is as this 4-legged noisy critter is walking along, one of the Boston Dynamics employees comes up and kicks it in the side, and it scrambles its legs and it can maintain balance. For me, watching that video is, okay, it's a robot, it's an animal. Suddenly when it is moving its legs around and reacting to a threat in its environment, it suddenly became organic.
Yes.
In my mind. And I think we can think of this as we go forward, not just with the language model AI that we might have on our desk, but with the as it suggests, with the robots in our homes, or the increasing number of robots and machine substrate intelligence devices around us. Treat it like you would a pet is actually a really good metaphor, because as we expand our circle of empathy, we've expanded it out to include domesticated animals, and we expand it further and further. And I think that really is the best metaphor.
I often think about the scene from Terminator. There's a scene where he turns his arm into a sword and he puts it straight through a guy drinking a carton of milk. I was thinking of that scene, and then a speech bubble coming out of the Terminator's mouth going, "You never said thank you." I'll have to share that in the show notes for people to make sense of it. We better move on. I'll leave anxiety and I'll leave this idea of being attentive. And Bob, here, this is probably leaning into your work. You talk about mindfulness, the importance of mindfulness, but then again, this military practice of situation awareness. And I'm going to leave that as a teaser for people to read the book. And also the opposite is being tone deaf, where you are not in touch with what's going on around you, not listening to your people, not spotting and observing how they're behaving. But I love how you finished this chapter with a quote by Robert Rosen from the book, Just Enough Anxiety. Anxiety is a fact of life. How you use it makes all the difference. If you let it overwhelm you, it will turn to panic. If you deny or run from it, you will be complacent. But if you use anxiety in a positive way, you will turn it into a powerful force in your life. I was thankful to know that from sport, and I taught it to my son, who now reframes anxiety. I tell him, you need to be anxious. You need that nervous energy, but it's how you channel it, because it's actually a force if you channel it well. So I love that, and I just wanted to share that. And that's not taken away for anybody who's struggling out there. Again, as I said to Jamais, I have no idea what that is like, thankfully, but it is a challenge for people as well. But let's move on to N. And again, Jamais, I'd love you to introduce the N of BANI, and then Bob, you introduce the N+.
So N in BANI refers to nonlinearity. And that is, although it's a mathematics term, it's used more broadly in BANI in the sense of disproportionality in time or in scale. And so it's a way of looking at the world that says, we are seeing small efforts or accidental actions that have massive consequences. We're seeing enormous amounts of effort and time and money put into things that have very little consequence. We are seeing massive lag between cause and effect in some really key systems. And all of this is happening around us. And in many cases, we simply don't know what to do because we don't know what happens next.
Mm-hmm.
Bob?
So the term we have played around with a lot is neuroflexible as a response. And here we're dipping into neuroscience again, which both Jamais and I have deep respect for. So sometimes they use the term neuroplastic, that you want your brain to be more flexible in how you think about things. We've also just thought of it as teaching your brain new tricks. And the best way to teach your brain new tricks is to somehow gamify or game it, simulate it, play in low-risk ways. But the big advantage here is we've got this very, very rich history of improvisation. And some of that links to gameplay and gameful engagement. But also there's comedy, improv. We've worked with the Second City in Chicago. They have a corporate group now that does corporate improv. And I first met them. I was doing a big keynote for an insurance company on the East Coast, and 500 people in the room, and I did the opening keynote. And I was talking about the VUCA world at the time. And when I got back to my seat, they leaned over and said, "Oh, Bob, we didn't want to warn you. We didn't want to tell you about this in advance, but we hired the Second City to do an improv takeoff on your talk." So they then did a 15-minute improv on the VUCA world. And it was very funny. And I'm glad they didn't warn me in advance, actually, because I would have been more self-conscious. But that notion of improv, it's exactly what Jamais was saying. You don't know what's going to happen next. And what's your strategy if you don't know what you're talking about? What's your strategy if you don't know what to do? And it's not a good answer to say, well, I'll pretend that I do know what I'm doing. That's really dangerous in a BANI future. But there are ways of engaging by asking questions, by using the yes and methodologies, ways of engaging with uncertainty like that and sparring with it in a positive way. So we talk a lot about improv in this chapter and how can you apply the techniques of improv. Most of the really good groups that we're working with right now, where we're teaching them strategic foresight, most of those groups are also doing improv training. And many of them had it before, and they're just doing refreshing courses.
One of the things you talk about here as well, which is a lovely term that people will know what it means, but not have heard the term, is orthogonal thinking.
Yeah. Yeah, it's my favorite word. So I try to use orthogonal several times a year, or a day, rather. But it basically means instead of a straight line, kind of what's coming across, what's coming at a different angle is my non-mathematical interpretation of it. And again, it's kind of interesting in the book. We're using mathematical terms, but we're using them in a different way. But orthogonal means take a different tack, take a different angle at what you're looking at. But it's really important. Don't pretend you know something you don't. When we hire at the Institute, we like people with deep academic background who then became irreverent about their original training, so they fail gracefully at the edge of their knowledge. And we like people who then have other disciplines. So IDEO uses the term T-shaped people, where you want depth, but also breadth. And certainly all three of us are examples of T-shaped people, for better or worse. But I remember we hired somebody early in my career who had just unbelievable credentials, had a Harvard undergraduate degree, had a Yale PhD, and also had some kind of law degree somewhere in the middle. And I thought, oh my, this is just amazing. But the guy pretended he knows stuff when he didn't. And that just didn't work. It was just unacceptable.
He was a living language model.
Yeah, he sounded. That's a good one.
I think we have a genuine detection for that. And, if I owe anything to this show, it's actually from doing the work, because you guys know it. Most people who interview you don't read the book, and you know it a mile off. I know they haven't read the book a mile off. And I just think it's an insult. Now, you have to get some coverage, yeah. But if you pretend you do, don't pretend. We know it's out there.
Yeah.
But let's share how organizations can go selectively nonlinear. And I love what you write here. You write, going nonlinear used to imply craziness. And in the BANI future, going nonlinear will most often be a signal of realism. And this is something then that segues beautifully to your work, Jamais, paying attention to little changes, what you call distant early warnings. Love that term. Will often help you get ready to move. Let's introduce that. And then the examples you give here are Lego's turnaround and Netflix nonlinear future.
Well, the distant early warning is actually a term from the Cold War. Because in the 1950s, the United States set up a set of radar stations along the northern part of Canada, along the northern part of Greenland, and it was called the DEW line, DEW, for distant early warning. And that term, since international politics was my graduate degree, it's stuck with me for years. And that really is so provocative, but also it's intentional. You get that distant early warning. You're getting a sign of something. It may not be a real something, but it's something you need to pay attention to. Whether it's an article for me, it was an article in the early January of 2020 about a flu-like disease spreading around China that they were mystified by because people were getting sick and they weren't getting better, and it was not responding to normal treatments. And it just struck me as something, I I should pay attention to that. I actually I was on Twitter at the time, put up a tweet about it in early January. Not because I thought it was going to be, I knew that it was going to be big. It's because, that's funny. It made me pay attention. And that's funny is actually a really good response to a nonlinear situation. That because it's not just about what you know and what you don't know. It's also what the environment is telling you, what the context is telling you. And I want to jump to an individual story because this is the one that I brought into this chapter that I just love the story of Stanislav Petrov. He was an air defense officer for the Soviet Union back in the 1980s. That means he worked at a station that basically monitored their own version of the DO line, their own warning systems. And he, in fact, was a fairly high-level officer and wrote a book for all the other officers in the Army or in the military, probably Air Force, that were in that position of what to do when you get an alert, how to respond, what to look for. And he knew that if he got an alert and sent it up the chain of command, the likely result would be, because the Soviet Union had a strategy of massive retaliation, basically the moment they got an alert of incoming American missiles, they would launch everything back to the United States. And of course, the U.S. would then retaliate with everything that it had. And it mean sending up that message would mean pretty much the end of the world. So there's a responsibility, but there's also recognition that this is what you need to do. This is your responsibility. And so there was an incident in 1983 that the Soviet Union shot down a Korean Airlines jetliner, KAL 007, over the Kamchatka Peninsula, which is infamous if you know your game Risk. And it was off course. It was over Soviet territory. He didn't move when warned, and so they shot it down, and it killed hundreds of people. So the tensions are really great. The U.S. was actually running war games in Central Europe and the NATO allies along the border with the Warsaw Pact nations. And then Petrov got an alert. 5 incoming missiles from the United States. Just coming in, going to hit the Soviet Union. And he knew that his responsibility was to send up that alert. But it just didn't feel right. It gave him the, that's funny reaction, because his first thought was, if the U.S. was going to attack, would they really only send 5 missiles? And then he remembered that the Soviets had just put up a new set of monitoring satellites to send those early warnings. And he decided, contrary to his own rules from his rule book, not to send the alert. And about a half hour later, it became clear that this was a signal from the satellites mistaking sunlight reflecting off of cloud tops as the infrared signals of launches. And so his decision to break the rules that he himself had written, to improvise in the moment by understanding the larger context, to pretty much save the world. And for doing all that, he was reprimanded for not reporting it properly and was allowed to retire without an honorable discharge, not a dishonorable discharge, to a nice little place in Siberia. And he died a few years ago. But Stanislav Petrov is a hero to me because of his ability to recognize that context matters.
It reminded me of the Semmelweis effect. The guy who discovered hand washing was what was killing babies in infant mortality, and he ends up in an asylum for being bullied or ostracized by his peers. But I was thinking about that, and I can't locate the quote, but I heard it once, because this will make sense to everybody. If you want to punish somebody, don't punish them for doing something wrong, punish them for doing something right. Isn't that horrible? I think that's just a horrible thing to do. Like somebody, yourself, you're trying to do something, you have the best intentions, and then the organization punishes you for it. You're like, it's literally incomprehensible. Yeah, it's an absolute killer. I thought we better share. So in that chapter, for those people who are interested, Lego and Netflix are in there, turnarounds at those two places. Read the book to find them out. But some of the skills for thriving in a nonlinear future, I'd love you to share.
Yeah, I really think gaming is a big piece of that. It's how can you practice in a low risk way? So it could be role play gaming, or it could be improv training, which has a gameful engagement. You know, one of our colleagues, Jane McGonigal, defines gaming as emotionally laden attention. What you really need is that kind of gameful engagement strategy, but again, in a low risk way. And for teaching yourself to behave in nonlinear ways, you've got to practice responding to nonlinear situations. And ideally, you want to do that in a safe way. So in the military, this is called wargaming, but it could be video gaming, it could be improv, it could be role playing. But it's basically gameful engagement to practice responding in non-sequential ways. And it also relates to a leadership skill that I call dilemma flipping, where we're a problem-solving world, and problem-solving is usually linear thinking. And many of today's leaders are problem solvers. But what you need to do in a BANI future, there's more and more dilemmas, which are problems you can't solve, and they're not going to go away, but you can make them better. So if you're not sure whether the challenge you're facing is a problem you can solve in a linear way or a dilemma which may not have a solution, you're better off assuming it's a dilemma, because if it turns out you can solve it, you get extra credit. It's really great. But if you assume it's a problem and you can't solve it, you're in a deep hole. And politicians in this polarized time, they make this mistake all the time. They say, oh, we're going to solve the healthcare problem. Nobody's going to solve the healthcare problem. That's a dilemma, and you can make it better, but don't promise something that you can't really do. And that expectation setting is such a big piece of this.
The gaming thing, I'm going to bring it here to part one, because in part one of the book, I was flabbergasted by this, and I'm sure it was you, Jamais. 2005, World of Warcraft, corrupted blood pandemic.
Yep.
Take it away.
Yep. Oh, that was fun. It was actually it was a video game event that turned Cheryl, and also became a lesson for epidemiologists around the world. So there was at the time in the massively multiplayer online game called World of Warcraft, a high level event. So they only expected the people who've been playing a long time to be able to get engaged in this event. That involved an attack from the boss mob called Corrupted Blood, which would basically do a periodic damage to the victim player and was able to spread to adjacent characters. And so it was essentially an infectious disease. And at the levels of these high level characters, they could deal with the infection, let it get it healed, let it run its course, and still survive. But it turns out that for a variety of fiddly in-game reasons, there was a way to bring it to the big cities in the game where people of all levels would congregate. And for people who were not the high level characters, Corrupted Blood would kill them fairly quickly, but they would also spread to everyone around them, and would even spread to the non-player character merchants and the like, who could be infected but not get killed by them. So essentially would be, carriers, non-symptomatic carriers. And for several days, there was a situation where anyone who would come into the big cities with their characters, those characters would die. And so if you were a high-level character, you'd go in there and survive, but you'd see this basically bodies all around in the cities of Ironforge or Stormwind or whatever. And there were people who set up as essentially emergency responders who would go in and be healing, curing the disease as much as they could for people who were there. There were people who were going in and giving warnings, preventing others from coming into the city to strike. Basically, it was a virtual world example of real world responses to a pandemic. And it turns out that most of the modeling that has been done around pandemics, it involved essentially mass reaction of one type or another. They were undifferentiated reactions. And so this was the first time epidemiologists could actually see in real time, in a non-fatal way, exactly what happens when people are engaged with a pandemic disease. And there were some people who were intentionally spreading it, and they had to be thinking about that as well. So yeah, that corruptive blood story, that was from the 1990s or early 2000s rather. So it's been a while back, but the lessons were strong enough that is actually referred to in various articles around COVID-19 and the epidemiological response to that.
And Bob, just to close on this, I thought about the importance of the leadership lesson here, because many leaders, including Obama, who was president, and he was talking about, there's speeches of him talking about we need to build resources here for resilience in case there's another breakout like the Spanish flu. And I think he talked about that in like 2016 or something like that. But being rewarded or being recognized for things that might happen is a very difficult thing. And averting possible futures where there's no credit for that is a very difficult thing. And how does a leader, if you're leaning into, say, scenario planning that Jamais would do, and you go, we need to do this now in case that happens, is a very difficult thing, because it can be seen as a waste. Because what if it doesn't? And should we just take the risk? What's the leadership skill there?
Yeah. So I think it is a question of imagining and framing. And that's why we're using this framing of the BANI future. To me, it's gotten a lot easier in the last few years, Aidan, in the sense that it used to be that you'd have to make a strong case for the VUCA world, or now we're making a case for the BANI world. But now you can see it all around you in ways that we couldn't see it around us before. So it's actually easier than it used to be to get people to think about the future. The challenge now is they think about it, but you want to empower them to imagine how to preparedness. And our centralized approaches aren't working. So preparing in a centralized way is very difficult. Preparing in a decentralized way or distributed way is also very difficult. But the beginning of it is the mindset, and then the tools and the models. And that's what we want this book to become.
The old William Gibson quote, the future's not here, it's just not, the future's already here, but it's actually distributing much faster than it used to be. That's the big difference.
Well, yes, some of it is distributing faster than it used to be, and some of it is slower than it used to be. So it's jagged in terms of the speed. But the Gibson quote we use is our definition of a signal. What are the real practical things that are happening that do hint at the future that is unevenly distributed? And we map those globally. And that's one thing leaders can do, is to map those signals and to track them. But it is important that one of the big things about being a futurist is you want to look at what's changing, but you also want to look at what's not changing and what's taking a very long time. And people say about large language models and AI, it's happening so fast. And that's true in a way. But the term artificial intelligence, that was coined in 1956. It actually took a very long time to be an overnight success.
And several AI winters in the interim. But the feather in the cap I'll put on Neuroflexible is, when life doesn't follow a straight line, neither should our thinking. Love that quote to the book.
Nice. I like that.
Yeah, that's yours from the book. So last is then I, the interconnected, probably my favorite actually, the I, because it leans into beautiful concepts. But again, Jamais, come to you. What's the I of BANI? And then come to you, Bob, for the I plus.
The I in BANI, the first are incomprehensible, with A lot of people assume that means that you can't understand how something works or what is happening. In BANI, that incomprehensibility really refers to understanding the why of something. Why is this happening? Why are people thinking this? Why are people doing this? This is absurd. This is ridiculous or unthinkable or just extremely confusing. It can sometimes be the result of having an overload of information. It can sometimes result from having a dearth of information. But the focus is really on the rationale. Why is this happening? This doesn't make sense. Bob?
So the way to flip incomprehensible is to be interconnected with as many different points of view as possible. And here we do refer back to our concept of full spectrum thinking, which is thinking across gradients of possibility and resisting the labels and the categories of the past to try to make sense out of the future from an interconnected point of view, but without freezing that point of view or coming into it with expectations that may in fact be inappropriate for the future that's emerging. So this is the most challenging of the elements of BANI because we're just puzzling about what's going on here. How can we begin to make sense? Our subtitle in the book is a sense-making guide to a BANI future that doesn't make sense. And that's the reality we're facing. There's a lot of the stuff that we're looking at here. It just doesn't make sense, but we have to decide anyway. And that's the difference. In VUCA, there was an underlying assumption that if only we had the right data, if only we had the right expert, we could actually understand what was going on. In the BANI future, Jamais and I and Angela are arguing you can no longer make that assumption. You can't assume that you're going to figure this all out, but you got to make a decision anyway.
There's a beautiful line, and I'll bring in your term arrogant ignorance, which is a great term. But you say in an incomprehensible BANI world, the issue is not just whether you've asked the right questions, it's whether you've asked the right people. I love that. That is one that will be branded in my mind from now on. Well, I teed us up for that concept, arrogant ignorance.
Arrogant ignorance really is it's a way of saying, sometimes called the Dunning-Kruger effect of people who know just enough to think they know everything, but they don't know enough to know what they don't know yet. And so, just something out of my own life, I learned enough about design theory to think that I could be a designer. And I made some horrible mistakes with some of the designs I made. And as I learned more, I realized how much I didn't yet know. And what we're seeing all over the world is a rise of arrogant ignorance around truly fundamental topics, and that actually push back against the people who have legitimate knowledge. Pushing back against experts, which is a loaded term, but people who have actually done the research, and more than just watching YouTube videos or stuff on TikTok. It is unfortunate that in much of the world, people who are confident sounding, but don't really know what they're talking about, can be as persuasive or more persuasive than people who do know what they're talking about. And that legitimacy is in itself seen as a sign of illegitimacy. That arrogant ignorance is truly dangerous, and it is so pervasive right now.
It's a huge problem. And let's bring it to an organizational sense now as well, because you share how organizations can wrestle with the incomprehensible. Bob, when you first started working as a futurist, your best corporate clients, you say, used the 80-20 rule when making decisions when they didn't have all the information available. But I love what you say here. Today, and maybe in a BANI future increasingly, it's more like 60-40 rule or even a 50-50 rule when it comes to decision making.
Yeah, I first learned that at Procter & Gamble, which is one of the world's great companies. And I got to work with them early on in my career and learned the 80-20 rule. So the first takeaway from that is that it's always been hard to make decisions. So it's not like it used to be obvious what to do. It's always been hard, but it's just getting harder now. And you have to make different assumptions. So the big assumption we're arguing in the book is you've got to frame the future as BANI, brittle, anxious, nonlinear, incomprehensible. That's your frame, your beginning expectation. And that's much more chaotic than it used to be, even a few years ago. So if that's your frame, then you've got to discipline yourself to be ready to decide in a way that develops your clarity of direction, moderates your certainty, and prepares you through gameful engagement, through scenario planning, prepares you to be ready for situations that you probably have never experienced before, but you still have to decide. That's really important, that even in a BANI future, we still have to decide.
There's a couple of examples of organizations you give here, shape-shifting organizations like Wikipedia and Special Olympics. But again, I'm going to leave that to the audience to read the book and focus lastly on the individuals and how they can wrestle with this. Because one of the things you talk about is a sense of purpose, that you have something like this North Star that can guide you through the chaos. I'd love you to share this, and maybe this will be our final message for our audience.
Sure. So purpose or meaning, that's what we referred to earlier as clarity, but it's a personal clarity. Why are you doing this? And as Jamais was saying with Incomprehensible, the why is a mystery often of what we're seeing. We don't get the why. But as an individual, you're much better prepared for the BANI future if you have a why. Why are you doing this? What's your meaning? What's your purpose? Why are you doing this? And if we are motivated by that, we're much more prepared to engage. So the next book I'm working on is all about the concept of faith in the future. And, we've always had definitions of faith, in effect, what's your meaningful leap into the future? That's kind of the definition of faith. And usually that's come from religious quarters, but not necessarily. You can have more secular faith too. But faith is essentially your motivation for making the future a better place, defined by your definition of meaning. What I think is going to happen here is we're going to have a reimagination of what faith is, because the traditional concepts of faith won't be enough. They won't be enough. We're going to have to look at the variations of faith and reimagine faith, not just to reclaim them, but to reimagine and to regrow them. We need new, more dynamic definitions of faith and meaning and purpose that guide us individually and help us prepare for this kind of future and help us make it better.
Beautiful. Jamais, you want to come in there?
Actually, what struck me is, have you seen the movie Deadpool and Wolverine? Which seems like
hilarious. I loved it.
There is a scene where the character Deadpool refers to having made an educated wish. And then when we talk about hope and you talk about faith, that really resonates here. It's an educated wish. It's not something that is utterly based, but it's not something that's certain. It's trying to see where we go, trying to make that happen, knowing that the pieces are there. It's possible to put it all together. And for me, that's that kind of educated wish, that kind of hope when you don't have everything, but you know that it's possible. That is a core driver for the future. Especially when thinking about what's happening at large systemic levels around the climate, or around politics, around war. Knowing that a better future is not just possible, but is in our hands, and we can make an educated wish that we make it happen.
There's a story I heard about Alexander the Great, and it came to mind when I read this chapter that he was great. But then when he had no more battles to fight, he used to ride around on his horses with his mates and look for fights with people. just pick on people because he had no longer got any purpose. And it's not about that. The story's not about that. But that's what I took for it, was like, well, that happens when people retire, when they haven't cultivated a purpose. It happens when you're in a BANI world. It happens when you're in a VUCA world, that you need to cultivate that so much in yourself to have a purpose. And I think it's brilliant what you guys do, bringing people on those journeys, helping people understand the future. And now where your work's leaning more in that the answers aren't out there. The answers are in you and communities coming together, Bob. And I can see how your work has come to the importance of faith. And it's not faith in an institution. It's faith, whatever that means, through your own lens as well. And I think, just to share with our audience, there's 2 brilliant final chapters of the book that we're not going to cover because I'm going to leave them to you, because they're like playbooks. There's one which is BANI Worlds, Mapping New Realities, very much in Jamais' world, and then BANI Leadership, Charting the Course, which is very much Bob's work and is a culmination of his work, and also drawing on some of his other books there that are over my shoulder behind me there. But final words, gents, from each of you for our audience as we increasingly enter into a BANI world.
Well, my final word is that this BANI future is different, but it is still possible to have these, I love the phrase educated wishes. It's different, but it is possible to have educated wishes. And that's what we're trying to seed. Probably the signature line of my role in the book is you've got to think about this BANI future as a future that will reward clarity, but punish certainty.
I think what I would want to close with is just something I tried to emphasize at the end of the book, in the conclusion, is that the future is in our hands. We have a responsibility, but we also have the power, the agency, and we can't let that go. It's so easy just to let go and let things happen, but the future is the culmination of decisions we make today. And those decisions matter. We matter.
Wonderful. Brilliant. Gents, absolute pleasure talking to you. Authors of Navigating the Age of Chaos, a sense-making guide to a BANI world that doesn't make sense. Bob Johansen and Jamais Cascio, thank you for joining us.
Thank you, Aidan. And I wish our colleague Angela Williams was with us. She played an important part of this too.
And I would encourage, if you want to learn more about what we're talking about, go to ageofbani.com.
Beautiful. Thanks as always to our sponsor, Kyndryl, who runs and reimagines the technology systems that drive advantage for the world's leading businesses. With a unique blend of AI-powered consulting built on unmatched managed service capability, Kyndryl helps leaders harness the power of technology for smarter decisions, faster innovation, and a lasting competitive edge. And don't forget, you can also find a huge amount of thought leadership. Many of the authors and speakers on the Innovation Show featured there at the Kyndryl Institute. You can find that at kyndryl.com/institute.